Hi there, Rob Whiten here. Thanks for joining me on the Dragon's Teeth gaming channel. And today I'm talking about board games. Now, not Monopoly or Cluedo, as enjoyable as they may have been, or perhaps not at family Christmas. No, I'm talking about war games specifically. I think the first board game I ever played or ever had was Avalon Hill Africa Corps, set in the North Africa campaign, of course. And I remember it as being quite an involved and detailed game, and in particular you had to pay close attention to your supply lines. So that was quite an interesting sort of grand strategy game. Now, I also had a strong interest in fantasy gaming at that time, particularly Middle-earth tabletop battles. So these two games, when they came out, really caught my eye. One is the Battle of Five Armies, put out by TSR. And the other is, well, this is actually three games in one. The Games of Middle-earth, and this was put out by SPI. Now, it's been decades since I played either of these, so I'm not going to do a full review of them, but I thought it'd be nice to have a look through them and see if I can give you something of the flavour of each game. So the Battle of the Five Armies was originally published by a company called Law in 1975, and these were then taken over, or the game was republished by TSR. TSR, of course, very famous for publishing Dungeons and Dragons. So this game is written by Larry Smith, and this particular edition, it dates to 1976. So I probably would have bought this about 77, maybe 78. The interesting thing is that this game is totally unlicensed. I'm not sure quite how they got away with that. Perhaps they get around it by not using sort of specific names. Those Smorg is definitely mentioned, and of course all the characters are there, well, certainly in terms of elf armies and goblin armies, and Bjorn the Bear Man is mentioned by name. So I'm not quite sure. The Tolkien estate is quite notoriously litigious and very strict, so I'm not exactly sure how they got around that. So what we get in the box is the main rulebook, looking a little worse for wear, but it does date back to 1976. Not a huge amount of rules. This is quite a thin rulebook. Quite often with these games, particularly Avalon Hill and SPI, they could be very complex. But the rules, from what I remember, are fairly straightforward, and it was quite an easy game to play. That's pretty much it. You get a table at the back there, terrain effects chart, because of course the terrain for this battle is very specific. And there on the back is our combat results chart and missile effects chart. And a nice little picture of Smaug there, facing off the dwarves. So here are the counters. I don't know if these are complete sets or not. They should be, because this has been boxed up for a while. So there's no reason for anything to be missing. And you get three numbers on the counter. That's your stats for that particular unit. I think each counter represents about 50 figures. So of course there's, I think, about 500 dwarves. I'm not sure how many elves, but when it comes to goblins and orcs, well, there's thousands of them. So that's the map. I guess by today's standards that might look fairly basic, but you know, it does the job. And of course, as we say, this is a very specific setting, because we've got the two arms of the mountain coming out. We've got the entrance to Smaug's lair here, with the little lake built up the river. And then we've got the outposts on each spur of the mountain. So the battle, as I'm sure you'll remember, was basically the dwarves and elves were going to have a bit of a punch up. There were some humans involved as well from the town of Dal, and they were just going to get into it when a huge army of orcs and goblins turned up, accompanied by wargs and bats. And that pretty much sets the tone of the game. You have your, let's call them the good side, sets up with the dwarves here, and I think the elves can go along the arms. There's humans set up, and basically you get swarms and hordes of orcs coming in, and the forces of good have to try and hold until Bjorn and the eagles turn up. So from what I remember, it was a pretty fast moving and quite tense game as well. Pretty easy to play. There were some optional rules. You could add in things like hidden movement and some other ideas as well. But overall, I remember it as being quite a fast-moving and tense atmospheric game. Most of the reviews at the time seemed to agree. It was reviewed in White Dwarf issue 3, which shows you how far back it goes. I think they gave it a 5 out of 10, which I thought was a little bit mean. But they did point out that the game did capture the atmosphere of the battle, that kind of desperate hanging on, waiting for reinforcements. Of course, this isn't published anymore, but I'm sure if you look around you can find a copy. In fact, I did see a copy on eBay, I think it was recently, but it was going for something like 150 quid or maybe $150. But from the looks of it, that was a pristine game. I think it was complete. Not like this one where all the counters have been taken out, so you don't know if everything is there or not. Would I spend that much on it? No, probably not now, but I'm glad to have it, and I think at some point we will dust this off. Maybe I'll take it down on a Monday night and we'll see if we can get a game or two out of it. The second game is SPI's War of the Ring. Well, as I say, really it's 3 games in one. Now, this was licensed. This was approved by the Tolkien estate, and I've got a feeling this game was tied into the Ralph Bakshi film, because this came out in 77, I think, and the film was 78, so not too far apart. And I'm sure I've seen a copy of this, or at least the War of the Ring game, with the artwork from the Bakshi film on it. So I'm imagining there was some sort of tie-in there. SPI, of course, were a major game manufacturer at the time. They were set up in the late 60s and through to the, I think they went out of business sometime in the mid-80s perhaps. They produced a huge amount of games, very good games, very detailed games. And this was one of their most successful. This actually topped their bestseller charts for a couple of years. So let's take a look and see what we've got. Again, I don't know if this one is complete. Battle of the Five Armies is just some counters. This one is counters and cards and some very nice maps, as we'll see in a moment. So this is the first game, this map. This is the game called Sauron, and it depicts the Battle of Dagorlad, which was Sauron versus the last alliance of men and elves. If you know your Lord of the Rings or you watch the movies, this was the battle just before Isildur cut the ring off of Sauron's finger. So it takes place just outside Mordor. In fact, this is the part in the film, or in the book I should say, where the dead marshes are. That was the actual site of this battle. So this is your fairly typical SPI game. You've got hexes, you've got counters for the individual units. Both games run off of a standard set of rules, which makes sense if you're packaging them together. But then for each game you also get some exclusive rules, mostly around how you deploy the forces, reinforcements, and any special unit and leader capabilities. Of course, you do have some common characters in both games, such as the Witch King, but in the Sauron one here we get something called the Beast of Mordor, which sounds great. I don't remember that. I can't remember exactly what the beast did or what it was, but that looks like fun. And of course your victory points and conditions are going to be different for each game. This is the map for the Gondor game, and I'm sure of course Lord of the Rings fans will recognise this structure here, because this game depicts the siege of Minas Tirith. So we're on the Pelennor fields and we've got the forces of Sauron besieging the city. So again, that runs off the standard rules, but you have this page or two of exclusive rules as well, particularly dealing with various types of reinforcement, and of course rules for siege. So we've got siege equipment, breaching walls, scaling walls, boiling oil, all that kind of stuff. And it's nice to see they've got the severed heads in there as well. As you may remember in the book, the forces of Sauron catapulted the severed heads of the Gondorians they'd killed over the wall and into Minas Tirith. There's some magic here in this one as well. naturally we've got the Witch King, Lord of the Nazgul, and we've got Gandalf as well. So there's a prospect of a Gandalf Witch King standoff. The other nice thing we have in here is the idea of the return of the king. Aragorn turns up and unfurls his banner. Perhaps he even used the Palantir, and that of course will have a major negative effect on the morale of Sauron's forces. So that's the two board games, if we can put it like that, both specific battles, both from what I remember enjoyable and detailed, but not overly detailed. I think if you look at some board games like Squad Leader, for example, and others, they could get very complex, but this was fairly straightforward to play and quite enjoyable. And that brings us on to the War of the Ring. Now, look at this for a map. I can barely fit this on my table. In fact, I should have turned it the other way round. But that just gives you some idea of the scale of this game. Well, I say game, there's really two games in one here. The first is you can just have the character game. So that's the Fellowship trying to destroy the ring. So they might start, I can't remember if they start in the Shire or if they start at Rivendell, but basically they have to get the ring potentially to Mount Doom or whatever they want to do with it. There are other options. And of course you've got the forces of Sauron out hunting for them. So in the character game you get cards for the various characters. There's the old Witch King again. Gandalf, the Hobbits, Boromir. So you get these forces of Sauron cards, which is mostly the ring wraiths, but then you also get these servants of Sauron as well. And from what I remember, these can be fairly random. So here we've got the Balrog, for example, and it's nice to see, look, the Balrog depicted there with no wings. That will please Tolkien purists. But also we've got things like Giant Renegade Troll and of course Shelob, last of the giant spiders. So the Fellowship make their way whatever route they want to choose, and they will encounter these various forces of Sauron at some point, and of course the wraiths and the orcs are out looking for them. Now I remember when we first played this, there is a later option for hidden movement, which I think works a lot better, because otherwise what you tend to have is Sauron, the Sauron player has to watch as this little group of Fellowship people just come marching down in there, and he can't really do anything about it because he doesn't know they're there. So that did work much better when we used the hidden movement option. You also get these event cards. For example, this one, Tom Bombadil intervenes. Any Barrow Wights present disappear. Can be used to avoid battling Barrow Wights. So again, there's all these nice little touches. Everything that is in the book, as far as I can remember, is here. So it's very faithful to the lore. But to that character game, you can also add the military aspect as well. And this then becomes a much more complex and involved game, because as well as that character journey going on, you're also managing the armies, whether that's the armies of Mordor or of the West. And there is also a 3-player option as well, which means that one person can play as Saruman and control the forces of Isengard. So that then becomes quite a complex game, part sort of war game, but with that nice touch of the individual characters and what you might call small events or small local events going on that of course can have a major influence on the outcome of the military side of it as well. And of course there's nothing to stop anyone having the ring. It doesn't have to be Frodo, but there's a nice mechanic whereby the ring will naturally slowly corrupt whoever's holding it and perhaps take them over to the dark side. Or is that another film? And added into the military campaign, there's a lot of additional characters. So we get Denethor, we get Celeborn and Galadriel, and again, there are individual things or events that may happen to them So for example, Ents Vent Rage, which is never a good thing to be in front of. Aragon uses the Palantir. Basically all those things in the book are in here. There's even rules for siege combat if you want to besiege Minas Tirith, or perhaps you want to besiege Isengard, who knows. So that's the War of the Ring. So if you want a fairly quick game, the character one doesn't take so long, but if you want something you can really get your teeth into, then you can try the full military campaign version as well. Again, I'm sure this is out of print by now, but I have seen copies. In fact, I saw one just recently on eBay for 50 quid, and that looked to be in very good condition. So if you have a look around, I'm sure you can pick this one up at a fairly reasonable price, considering the amount of gameplay you can get out of it. You've got to think that's almost 3 or 4 games in one. I just want to mention the artwork in this one as well, because it really is great. The 2 artists are a chap called Redmond Simerson and Tim Kirk. Now, Tim Kirk had already been involved in Tolkien art. He did a Tolkien calendar in '75, I think, and he was also involved in a company called Kriegspieler Fantastic that was set up by a guy called Duke Siegfried. And Duke Siegfried was in the UK in the sort of mid-70s, and he actually met up with Tolkien and said to him, I'd like to produce a range of pewter Lord of the Rings figures. And Tolkien was all for this. So that's something he started doing. He got Tim Kirk in to draw the figures. Unfortunately, Tolkien passed away before the project got going. But if you ever see Kriegspieler figures, or they later became Heritage, I think, and I just wanted to show you these orc figures because to me they look very much like the artwork from the game, and I wondered if these were designed by Tim Kirk. So if anyone knows where these figures are from, who made them, please do let me know. Okay, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed that excursion into Middle-earth. As always, please like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.